So welcome to Introduction to Interdisciplinary Research. And what I want to do tonight is really just share some perspectives on what interdisciplinary research is and what it isn't, but also how do we take the basic steps to go ahead and undertake interdisciplinary research. And interdisciplinary research may be us collaborating with other academics. That's kind of the norm, the commonality. But sometimes you might be someone like me who has training in a couple of different fields, and we bring from both or even three fields. We bring the knowledge, the techniques, the skills, and we bring that together and have a single person researcher, but actually draw upon the knowledge that we have gained and the techniques, the skills, the methodologies, the worldviews that we gain from different disciplines as well. So let's go on and look at the objectives for tonight. And it's really simple. I want to understand the broad concept of interdisciplinary research as it applies to your postgraduate research as a student, but also beyond. You know, what are we going to do after our PhD? And that's really, valuable for us as well. I want to explore the approach to undertaking interdisciplinary research. So how do we go about it? What do we do? And finally, I want to understand and appreciate the skill sets that are needed so that we can succeed in being an interdisciplinary researcher. Now, my introduction to interdisciplinary was back in the very early 2000s when I taught for Auckland University of Technology. And my department was actually interdisciplinary business, and it brought together all of the business disciplines and showcased the interrelationship. Rather than teaching accounting, and I'm sorry, Jap, I know you're here, we taught accounting with information technology. We taught it at the same time, the same lecturers with management, with marketing, because we wanted to understand the linkages, or we wanted to demonstrate to our students the linkages between all the different disciplines. And that was really the first time I was able to look in depth at interdisciplinary research, because I was forced into a university department that was purely based on everybody collaborating, but also drawing strength and drawing opportunities from the different disciplines. Now, interdisciplinarity, a big word, don't want to say it again. The emergence of this has really happened over a number of years. And while it's not really that much of an exciting thing, I just want to sort of go through the very brief history of interdisciplinarity so that we understand where it's sort of come from and what it has evolved out of, the needs that it has evolved out of. So in the 1920s, and I think it's very specifically 1926, if I'm not mistaken, the Social Science Research Council was formed. We probably don't even think about it. Tonight's probably the first time you've even heard of it. Not my first time, but probably my third or fourth only. In the years following World War II, there became both technological and social scientific demands for interdisciplinarity. There was an understanding that, look, coming from different disciplines, we can understand different things. And when two disciplines work together, we can actually solve unique problems that both of them have, but we can solve them through a different lens, and that's going to help. In 1972, the OECD did a report on interdisciplinarity and the problems of teaching and research in universities. And they were looking at how do we get out of the old-fashioned silos that we are part of in our department. And you'll see from the 70s onwards, universities started changing not only the names of the departments, but how they fitted into the broader faculties, how they joined together, and so forth. in 1979. So it took, what, 50 something years from the Social Science Research Council to develop the Association for Interdisciplinary Studies. And this was really a first move towards trying to initiate an interdisciplinary approach to research. And in 2011, we got the International Network for Interdisciplinarity and Transdisciplinarity. Now, I hate saying those words, but I'm going to sort of come to something in a couple of minutes, because there are a lot of terminologies that are closely related that are bandied around. And when I look at interdisciplinary research, it correlates with several of the others. So we might use slightly different terms with slightly different meanings to sort of talk about the same general thing. And that's kind of what I'm getting with where we're going here. Now, over the years, there were some drivers towards the need for interdisciplinary research. And this really came out of the fact that our understanding of knowledge, our understanding of how research is conducted, not only research methodology, but really the philosophy of how we undertake research and the philosophy of why we do research. And that kind of has helped shape us. Now, these drivers, and I've put them down in 5, really. The first one, the inherent complexity of nature and science. I trained as an economist. I might be ever so slightly embarrassed by that, because early phase economics is very simplistic. 2 assumptions, nothing changes, all these things. It's so unrealistic that it does not explain the world. It barely explains the one task that you're trying to do. But economics actually is there to explain how different systems work on a whole. It links with geography, which looks at the spatial elements of economic behavior. It links with accounting. It links with marketing. There's a lot of connections there. But that's the reality of things. We don't only understand something in a very narrow silo. The real world, there are so many factors that we cannot control that actually we need to embrace understanding all of this so that we can put together a better research program and ultimately explain and analyze different phenomena that have happened over time. There's been a drive to explore basic research problems at the interfaces of disciplines. So, whilst our 2 disciplines may approach something differently, when they come together, where the fundamental commonalities of how we look at things are, how do we solve problems? Now, if we solve basic problems there, how can we need to take on board more complicated problems? And interdisciplinarity allows that. We need to solve social or societal problems. Now, I know we're all from different fields and disciplines here, but at the end of the day, most of us are working on a problem that has a genuine impact on social life, on communities, whether that be a community, a very small niche community, or whether it be a broad community. We are looking at these problems. And social problems can't be solved only from one discipline, or at least we can't give a comprehensive overview. We can't give a comprehensive explanation if we are limiting ourselves to, say, a sociological perspective or an anthropological perspective. There is also the stimulus of generative technologies. And I'm going to have a laugh for a minute, because I wrote this webinar a couple of years ago, before the concept of ChatGPT, before the concept of AI hitting academia. And now we have, look, generative technologies, things that are helping us. But also because of that, we've got to be able to understand relationships in a much stronger way. And also we've got to look at the fact that expanding disciplinary boundaries are overlapping with others. And I think that's a really important one, because as our unique disciplines take on problems, we start seeing where they overlap to others. So when I was in my undergraduate, I was very interested in social and environmental geography, and not environmental geography in terms of saving the world and, saving resources, because my viewpoint on that's a bit odd, but it was in how we understand our own landscape. And a friend of mine who was a psychologist was running a summer school boot camp, Introduction to Psychology, for high school students, senior year high school students. She's like, Craig, can you come and do a lecture? I want you to do a lecture on environmental psychology, which I thought was, okay, I know nothing. Until I suddenly realized that what she called environmental psychology as a psychologist was actually an aspect of humanistic geography that I looked at as a geographer. And the two things overlap so well. The only difference was what we called it. The methods had some similarities, but it was able to, expand and grow. And why I talk about that is, look, this was an overlap, because as I'd studied environmental perception, as I'd studied the human environment interrelations, as I'd studied the cultural aspects of how we see our environment and what we do with it, nobody ever said to me, Craig, this is a psychology thing, when in fact it was very nicely overlapped. Now, this is happening more and more and more. And that's why there's, a push towards interdisciplinarity, because the same phenomenon is being studied by different disciplines through different techniques and coming up with similar and different results. But we've got to be able to look at, how do we triangulate that? How do we bring it together? How do we appreciate the perspective that a different discipline brings in? Now, let me sort of go into a definition of interdisciplinarity. And, forgive me as I sort of do a bit of the basic stuff first, but I want to lead into, how do we become interdisciplinary researchers? Now, back in 1997, it was actually called Interdisciplinary Studies. So the name itself has evolved. So, understand that there's a lot of terminology that has a close relationship, and it just evolves over time. So interdisciplinary studies is a process of answering a question, solving a problem, addressing a topic that is too broad or complex to be dealt with adequately by a single discipline or profession. I think this one's very important. An interdisciplinary problem is a big problem. It's something where our own discipline isn't enough to give a solid explanation or analysis of it. We can do a pretty decent job, but we need to bring in other perspectives to help explain it in a social context. So it draws upon disciplinary perspectives and integrates their insights through basically a more comprehensive perspective. And again, I want to just come back, too broad or complex a problem. We're looking at a big problem. We're looking at the insights that different disciplines can help shape our way of thinking about the solution to the question that we have. Now, here's where I get into the fact that there are overlapping terminologies. intradisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. It's exhausting, and I'm not necessarily going to explain in great detail all 5 of these, but you can understand, intra is within a discipline. So within economics, we have micro, we have macro, we have labor, we have globalization, which is my personal area. There are different things, and we take different perspectives, different schools of thoughts even, and we work with that. Cross-disciplinary is more comparison. It's taking 2, but being able to showcase, well, you look at it this way, I look at it this way, therefore it is something else. And that's also very acceptable. Multidisciplinary is bringing in several different disciplines to offer a lens, to offer a worldview or a viewpoint, to offer a perspective on the same thing. Interdisciplinary is taking the link between, and as discipline-specific researchers or the tools, trying to embrace all of them to get a single conclusion rather than a comparative conclusion. And transdisciplinary is across many, but unsure as to, or at least I'm unsure, to be honest, as to how it all interrelates. Interdisciplinary or interdisciplinarity occurs with differences in depth. And this is really important. And depth is what I mean by how far do we go into understanding the problem and the relationships between our discipline. So we have to look at how we borrow concepts from different disciplines, how we borrow methods or methodology from different disciplines. It is a problem-oriented collaboration. We have a problem we're trying to solve. We have perspectives, and we have to figure out how do these solution approaches come together. So how does a sociologist's toolbox of methodology work with an educator's toolbox of methodology together so that we can understand the research question about issues of education or issues of progress in society or whatever we choose to work on. We also need to look at the fact that broadening interdisciplinarity also increases unification. So the truth here is, as we become more interdisciplinary, we're actually bringing all of our knowledge together under a bigger umbrella. So the difference between geographers and economists is not so great today as it was 20 years ago. We get the emergence of a new interdiscipline, and that's really the overlap between where we're at. That overlap actually creates new niche areas, because not only am I looking at something and trying to solve it from my own discipline perspective, I'm now embracing new tools, new understandings to be able to solve it. That's a hybrid of 2 or 3. So to me, globalization, for example, can often be considered as interdisciplinary because it brings together, multiple strands, and it kind of has this like little overlap. So if we did, some Venn diagrams, we're getting things together from that. Now, this sort of idea is coming out of the 1990s, so it's not exactly new, but you can go searching for that. We also have a difference in scope. So we go from narrow to broad interdisciplinarities. And what we've got to look at is, such differences between disciplines affect the barriers that must be overcome. Probably taken is the wrong word. The barriers that must be overcome And that's really differences regarding things like norms and objectives. What does a sociologist try to solve versus what does an educationalist try to solve? Or what does a marketer try to solve versus what a geographer tries to solve? So we have to be able to understand those norms, appreciate what they are, but also deconstruct them a little bit, because we want to find common ground. That's our goal with interdisciplinary research. We want to find that common ground. We look at the fact that there are going to be different theories and models. And, if I look at, say, accountancy versus sociology. Now, you might look and think, how do those two come together? I promise you there are ways. But the theories that go into it are very different. We probably do not have a Marxist theory of anything in accounting, but we certainly do have a Marxist theory about how society operates and how it develops and how people respond to different, different systems and practices. So we have to understand that in an interdisciplinary practice, there are going to be unique theories and models that each discipline has. Our job as a researcher is to find ways that these models can work together to help us explain and analyze and interpret the data that we get, the situations that we face. That also relates back to the very assumptions about what knowledge is for us. What do we view knowledge to be versus what a different discipline will view knowledge to be as well. And that's also based upon societal positions and how that changes over time. Now, all I'm looking at here is, look, these are some of the things that we have to consider. It's not a roadblock in the sense that it's going to stop you from achieving the research that you want to have achieved. But what it is a speed bump that you've got to slow down for, and you've got to look at, and you've got to say, now I can see where the commonalities are, and now I can see where the differences are, and how can we embrace both to answer the research question that we are specifically looking for. So when is interdisciplinarity necessary or basically an added value? And this is effectively real-world interdisciplinary crises. The challenges of our era cannot be addressed through the experience of one research field alone. Overlaps are deeper than they appear, even if academia doesn't officially recognize them. And I think that's not something, new that I've said just now. It's come through. But effectively, the old keys don't open new doors, if that's kind of the phrase that I can use here. Most disciplines have recognized that there are limitations. Most disciplines have recognized that there have to be opportunities through other viewpoints, and that's interdisciplinary. But in many cases, the academic world itself does not want to recognize publicly or officially that we need help from a different discipline, because our history means we should have been able to do it ourselves. So there is still, from the older generation of academics, perhaps, still a little bit of pushback about the value and the power of interdisciplinary research. Let's look at curiosity. I apologize, I've spelt that wrong. Curiosity, humility, and self-reflection is very important for us. I talk a lot about positionality and reflexivity, which is really understanding our own role in the research process, why we are doing the research, the worldview that we have and the assumptions that we bring to the table through our various upbringing, let alone the training that we get at university. Cross-disciplinary encounters, and let's just interchange that with interdisciplinary, because I know I've sort of been very liberal with my choice of words here. But cross-disciplinary encounters tend to ask new types of questions. It takes place in a research climate that constantly recalibrates our understanding of reality, because we're given new ideas, we're given new ways to look at something. Ultimately, cross-disciplinary research encounters should provoke self-reflection. Not only me as Craig, what drives my research interests? What drives my understanding of the world? What drives my acceptance of certain things versus my rejection of other things? But it goes deeper than that. It's about, to what extent is my discipline failing to address the very problems that we are tasked with solving right from the beginning? So in terms of that, that's a really powerful self-reflection. It's not about me as a researcher. It's about me being part of a discipline that no longer can perfectly or even remotely acceptably offer solutions to to the questions, I should say, not offer solutions to the questions that we are asking as researchers. Now, I ask in this slide, an interdisciplinary attitude. And I really do mean it. It's like, do you have an attitude as an interdisciplinary researcher? Is there sort of a superiority complex? Is there sort of something about we're solving the world and you didn't? Or maybe something else? But I think it's important to be able to think about this. And interdisciplinary research raises awareness of how little we know beyond the safety of our own field. And I think this one is a huge issue. So I'm going to tackle this sentence or that particular statement in a couple of different ways. As PhD candidates, as postgraduate researchers, regardless whether you're doing doctorate, master's, postgraduate diploma, postdoc, even early career academics. At the end of the day, we are an expert in a niche, and we're pretty useless at the broader picture. And I don't mean that to be an insult, even though it might come across, but at the end of the day, we're trained to look at a funnel. And we're at the bottom of the funnel where we have the most knowledge about the littlest thing. And then we forget how to make a cup of coffee because that wasn't included in our research. So we kind of have that safety net of our little area. Now, for me, I've always been able to sort of float between a couple of disciplines, and because of my work experience, it's brought me into additional disciplines and helped me or forced me to understand those. But at the end of the day, my knowledge isn't fully comprehensive. There are a lot of things lacking. And if you've followed me for a while and you've come to my literature review webinars, this is also why I say, look, read as widely as you can. Don't just focus on the perfect articles that match your research topic. Understand your broader discipline as well. But beyond that, it's about understanding other disciplines. It's about us having exposure to related disciplines, either through self-teaching, through our own training as, what we've done as students and so forth. But it is about that. Now, I want to give an example in Malaysia, because this is a problem that academics in this country face. In order to do a PhD in Malaysia, you must have an undergraduate degree in the same subject. In order to lecture at a public university in Malaysia, a PhD in education must have had an undergraduate degree in education. Otherwise, they're not deemed acceptable. But that means the PhD in education is worthless. And I find that a real problem, because the world today is moving interdisciplinary. We are looking at how the transition happens. Myself, I went from geography to economics. I did undergraduate economics. I did a master's in development, which was basically geography. And when I came to my PhD, I went back to economics, even though I had not done second or third year economics at undergraduate level, because the training I received in another discipline was enough for me to understand the conceptual models, the processes, everything I needed, and it could work. But this is the thing, we've got to be able to get outside of our comfort zone and explore. The interdisciplinary attitude, researchers may differ in methods, but what's valuable is we share a similar puzzlement regarding a given topic. So when we look at something from a different viewpoint, a different angle, we still realize that there's a problem to be solved. And that's what we do. We solve that. And at the end of the day, I'm going to say we're at the fringe of our discipline, because it's not, the fringe is a negative thing. This is cutting edge. We're at the cusp of bringing things together. So we are doing something new, but for the traditionalists, we're kind of on the outer because we're wanting to rock the boat a little bit. We have to look very quickly collective versus individual, and I did address this right at the beginning. Interdisciplinary research is more often than not two or more, but several researchers coming together from different disciplines to curate a solution, to explore a solution to a problem. But the individual, the me side of things, we can be interdisciplinary researchers ourselves by simply having an appreciation of the toolkits available and the theories and the models of each of the disciplines that we're trying to find synergy with. So this is why in a postgraduate context, the dissertation you might do may actually be interdisciplinary, but probably the publications you're going to do that are a byproduct or a component product of that with others becomes a group activity. All I want to suggest here is, look, interdisciplinary research does not require 3 people. It requires one person who can understand a problem from 2 or more disciplines. And that can be each and every one of us in this room. Now I want to sort of move on to the more technical part of things, which is really guiding principles for interdisciplinary research. So basically, how do we do interdisciplinary research, or how do we become interdisciplinary researchers? So let me make a few general observations before I become a little bit more detailed with some steps. A grounding in disciplines is a prerequisite. Don't try to do interdisciplinary if you don't understand the fundamental toolkits and basis of different disciplines. It will take you a bit of time. Even if you're working with 2 or 3 other people, you still have to understand their perspective. It's not just let them do their work, see how it matches with yours and make a jigsaw puzzle. It is about you understanding and that communication between you as researchers, so that you're sharing the worldview that your discipline offers. They're sharing the same thing. So you get an understanding and you see those synergies. If it's ourselves only, it's about knowing that we have an understanding of that discipline and how research, how problem solving is undertaken, and how the discipline has evolved. We want to have a continuous recognition of a common goal, and that's really the problem we want to solve, which involves regular communication, provisional conclusions that our data may then come back and bite us and make us change our minds. Not a problem. That happens with any type of research that we do. The quality of research depends on the attention to preparation. So it's not so much what you undertake in terms of your data collection and your analysis and your synthesis. It's the preparation that you do, that disciplinary inputs and how it synthesizes in the preparation to be able to undertake that research. So if, for example, we're doing a simple survey research, but we're trying to bring across perspectives from 2 or 3 disciplines, it's making sure that all of those disciplines are represented in that research channel in a way that the data gives us responses or gives us answers that are valid to all of the disciplines involved. It's easier to encourage multidisciplinary rather than interdisciplinary, because multidisciplinary is, look, let's approach something from 3 different ways. Let's compare the results and let's make a conclusion. Multidisciplinary is taking each discipline independently and seeing what comes as a result. Interdisciplinary is empowering the different disciplines or empowering the research with the tools from each discipline together to get that result. We do need to network between disciplines. So one of my advice now, I mean, whether we're doing interdisciplinary research immediately today, whether it's something we're thinking, you know what, I think this is something I want to explore into the future. What you really need to do is open your connections beyond specialist domains. Don't just focus with anthropologists, or don't just focus with sociologists. Don't just focus with marketeers. Actually develop connections across different disciplines where you might find only initially 1 or 2 commonalities, but those commonalities will grow. And it enables us to be able to hook into not only interdisciplinary research with somebody, but hook into the advice that those individuals can give us when we're looking at understanding our own research itself. The drawback about interdisciplinary research, whether you're doing it as an independent person, i.e. you're doing your PhD, but you're trying to drawstring from 2 or 3 disciplines to be able to provide solutions, or whether you're doing it with a team of researchers, costs are usually higher. The cost of undertaking interdisciplinary research is certainly more than the cost of undertaking singular disciplinary research. And that's something that as researchers, as PhD candidates, as emerging early career academics, as emerging researchers, that's something that we have to take into account. But the benefits can be significantly greater. Now, I sort of want to move into the stages in the research process, because not only am I trying to share with you, the basics that we might do, right? But how do we do it from an interdisciplinary perspective? So if I'm looking at drawing this together, what are the stages that I'm going to do? And you'll probably find, although there's some parallels to typical monodisciplinary research, there's also going to be a few other things that are in there. So first up, we want to deal with our problem identification. Now, we know this because we've done it, or we're in the process of doing this, and we need to do it. But interdisciplinary approach is characterized by a research design that reflects the complexity of the issue and those affected by it. Now, when we do singular discipline, yes, we look at the complexity of the issue. We look at those affected, but we look at it as, as a geographer. We look at it as an accountant. We look at it as an architect, or we look at it whatever discipline that we're mainly focused on. When we're designing it, we've got to think, if from an interdisciplinary perspective, actually, how am I going to change that question? So the first step is getting your question or questions right. That's no different to anything else, but the right question in an interdisciplinary research is going to be ever so more nuanced than a right question in a monodisciplinary research. So the core question that we're going to ask is, whose problem is it? And who identifies the problem? And what I mean from that is, look, which discipline actually, I want to say owns the problem, but which discipline identifies most with the problem? And which discipline sees it as being a significant issue, i.e., which one leads the pack in that respect? We've got to look at sensitivities because different disciplines may approach things in different ways. And, any crossover or any concerns with this might be something that, it is a bit sensitive for some researchers, and we've got to figure out how do we do that. And we also need to have clearly articulated objectives that address all stakeholders. Now, I talk a lot about how we can engage with stakeholders in research, i.e., any interested parties in our research. The moment we go interdisciplinary to solve a problem, to examine a situation, we actually increase significantly the number of stakeholders that we have. The different parties that are interested in the outcomes of our research and the implications of those outcomes of our research change as we add an extra 1, 2, 3 disciplines into our approach to understand this. So not only are we looking at getting the question right, but we want to identify who are the stakeholders, what are their interests, and ultimately, what do we as researchers, either singular or multiple, but what do we as researchers want to or need to address with them or provide to them through the progress or completion of our research? I'm going to assume that if we are doing interdisciplinary, we might be doing it as a team, 2 or 3 people. So the new skill set that comes into our mind and our experience is team management. Because as a researcher, if we're not only working on our own, we're now working with someone else, we've got to be able to make sure that we can handle those interrelationships as well as the discipline-specific information. So this becomes stakeholder engagement and negotiation, and who's going to take responsibility for engaging with different stakeholders that are specifically related to their discipline. How do we build the team? How do we get along? How do we assign responsibilities? And how do we take leadership? And this one, intellectual leadership, administrative responsibilities. Who's steering the ship? I always use the example, the PhD, you should drive your own PhD with your supervisor. Now, if you're doing interdisciplinary with a team, who's going to drive that? And who's the follower? And what do they do? So the role of the various disciplines will vary. So some disciplines will only contribute a methodological enlightenment. This is a way that we approach the problem. Some disciplines may provide a theoretical construct. So you've got to understand And this is why you have to have an appreciation of the different disciplines that are there, because you have to be able to understand how or what can each discipline contribute to the bigger picture of the research. So is it they're going to contribute to a conceptual framework, or are they simply contributing a creative method that will help you address your questions more specifically? We also have to think about the selection of disciplines. And, by that, what I'm meaning is really where are the overlaps that are valid? For example, if I'm working in marketing, in research related to marketing and consumer behavior and things like that, is there an overlap with finance? Is there an overlap with accountancy? Is there an overlap with management? Is there an overlap with sociology? Is there an overlap with anthropology? Probably not with anthropology, to be fair. But we have to ask ourselves these questions. We have to decide which are the disciplines that we want to work with and which are going to contribute, which are going to give a value add to help us solve the problem we have at hand. And the final thing with team management is a model of teamwork. Who does what writing, who does what data collection, who does what data analysis, all of that. It's simplistic problems, but an element of what we have to consider. The data collection and analysis, unrelated to who's doing it, but the actual process of it itself, making sure that the techniques we use follow research objectives. And that's where we've got to make sure the common ground is clearly defined and clearly identified from that. We need to establish target dates. That's kind of management as well. But we also need analysis conducted with the recognition of the interdependence between different aspects of the problem. So our choice of data analysis has got to make sure that it addresses the needs of each discipline. And ultimately, the aim is to integrate the findings. So out of different data that we've got, how do we bring it together so that all disciplines that are part of this piece of interdisciplinary research agree? Because there's still a chance that a geographer may not agree with an economist, who may not agree with a marketeer. And that's not unusual to happen. It's part of the process, but we've got to find an aim. How do we integrate the different findings that we've got? We then have to look at the synthesis of the analysis and the presentations of the findings. So synthesis takes place throughout. So right from the design of the question that we're trying to solve, or the questions that we are trying to solve, all the way through the data collection, the methodology development, the data collection, the data analysis, at each stage, we've got to be able to synthesize so that when we get to the point that we've got an analysis, it's clear. It's not vague, it's focused, and it represents the viewpoints accurately of the disciplines. But we have to have an openness, a respect for our other disciplines. So each discipline has got to add to the experience, not detract from it. And that's maybe a very challenging one for us to mitigate, but it's certainly a goal that we have to ensure that we are working towards. That requires communication, consultation. The report writing stage, and this is going to happen for any of us, whether it is one researcher or multiple researchers, okay? But we need to make sure we integrate the findings. We are not trying to separate the findings out. We don't want to compare apples and oranges. We want to showcase that apples and oranges make a fantastic fruit juice. not two different juices. We need to showcase how they work together. Sorry, give me a second. And finally, we have to look, at least in this not finally, sorry, almost finally in this context, we need to look at capacity building. And this is really, as researchers, we need training. And what I mean here is, look, it's really great for us to want to embrace an interdisciplinary approach. But we do need training to be able to do this. We need to understand not only the other disciplines to an extent, not maybe to the level of expertise that we have in our own, but we need to understand what they're about. But we also need training in how we bring together these very specific perspectives that each discipline is bringing. And interdisciplinary research process ultimately requires extra skills and effort. And the methods that we need for supporting the interdisciplinary process. So let's just call it the skills that we need to hone up. Hopefully, as researchers, we're honing them anyway, right? But we do want to be able to develop how these work. And it's simply conceptual analysis, articulation of assumptions, really being able to understand that big picture, develop a framework, explain the assumptions, explain the framework as concisely and beautifully as possible, so articulation. We want to have an interdisciplinary research process model, and wait for a couple of minutes, I'll be presenting that in a way. But it's how does it work? How does it fit together? It's almost like, and I don't want you to misunderstand here, there are overlaps or similarities between an interdisciplinary research process model and a complicated mixed methods approach. The way in which you look at it has similarities, not the same thing. You know, don't say, Dr. Craig said interdisciplinary means mixed methods, because it doesn't. But what I'm saying is, when we look at the complicated mixed methods models, that kind of has parallels to where we are with interdisciplinary. We need to look at dialogue methods, and dialogue is talking or communicating. But, you know, an economist communicates in a particular way. A sociologist communicates in a different way. A gender studies researcher has even a different style of communication. And we've got to figure out, how do we bring, as interdisciplinary researchers, how do we bring different communication styles that are embedded in our very being from what we have done, you know, what we have learned through universities and so forth. How do we bring that together into what comes as a singular style? Now, I'm going to sort of go off track here a little bit and segue away from this for a second, because I also want to share with you a model that works. The idea is, when we write, we should be that singular voice that expresses where we're heading. But if we are doing an article, or if we are doing a book chapter, or even better, if we're doing a book, an interdisciplinary approach also allows us to have distinct voices in the manuscript. And one of the styles of writing that I like, I'm embracing it even at the moment with some things that I'm doing, right, is actually to have little case studies or little vignettes, or whatever it's called, from each discipline within the broader manuscript. So you've got a focus, but then you have a box that sort of steps out with a few paragraphs that says, this is the feminist studies approach. And then you have another box that says, this is how the historians view it. And what you're doing is you're weaving together the stories, but you're also allowing the space for each discipline to have a small example or presentation of their own perspectives. But the main narrative weaves it together and draws conclusions. So the dialogue methods you use isn't always about having that perfect voice, but it's about respecting the different voices that the discipline, respecting the different voices that the disciplines have and bringing them together to form conclusions. We have to focus on the science of team science. And basically that just means, how do we work together as academics? Because academics are not always the easiest people to get along with. Some of them are very dominant, some of them are very competitive, some of them are very helpful, and some of them are very singular in the sense that they don't want to collaborate with others, but there is a need to do it. So we really do have to understand team dynamics, not only as individuals, but team dynamics as competing academics who want to be the first to a solution to a question, to actually uphold the value and the tradition of their discipline versus, well, we're doing it together, let's all share the glory. Someone has to be first author, and that's a challenge. And finally, toolbox project, and it's really what do we have in our toolbox, intellectual toolbox, that we can use to develop where we're going. Now I want to move for a couple of minutes, and I'm just going to do a couple of slides here before I hand over to Farrell for a Q&A. But I just want to talk very briefly about methodology. And if you come back to here, I talked about a research process model. There's kind of a research process model here for you. And this is methodology in an interdisciplinary research framework. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I think this is something that, in reality, I could do a whole different webinar, maybe a couple of webinars, really looking at this and really thinking about it. But it's just a little bit more complex than our existing ways of approaching it. Research is a process and the methodology in interpretation of research frameworks. So Kumar 1999, I can certainly share the references if anybody wants that. I'll dig that out of my files. It's really a framework for proceeding. It's not about having a methodology itself, because that kind of fits. And this is why I say there's parallels to mixed methods. It's the process that we use. It's how the different things relate to each other, interact with each other, are interdependent or independent of each other. So in simple terms, a common sense approach to undertaking or being interdisciplinarity. It's really just mapping out, how do I do it? And if I can just sort of, since Savia's in the room tonight, everything that you and I have been discussing with that very large diagram you've done over the last couple of weeks, Savia, is actually similar to this as well, because although you're very focused on education, there's a couple of overlaps, but it is about the process that you've been working to. And the conceptual design, why and what of the research project includes the thinking and how we're going to exchange disciplinary knowledge, reading, and discussion. So again, process, but it's what will each discipline contribute to the research journey, and at what stage will each discipline contribute this to the research journey. And my final slide before I hand over to Farrell for a Q&A is methodology, again, in an interdisciplinary research framework, the technical design. So decisions on the methods and obtaining data to meet the objection, the execution of research design to get this, the decision on data, none of this is new stuff. because we have to do it anyway. But now it's saying, well, I've got 2 or more disciplines that are shaping that design. So what is the specific design that I'm going to do? It relates to embedding the data needs, the methodology preferences to meet the objectives. So, what works for one might not work for another. So how do we negotiate? For example, let's assume one of you and I are going to do some research, and you're a quantitative researcher. I'm a qualitative researcher. So how do we negotiate how those two will work together for our mutual benefit? Now, that's mixed methods, right? But it's a fundamental discussion, is how does an economist use qualitative data versus a marketeer who's using quantitative data? And how do we get something meaningful out of that? Which means we need a data analysis plan. So the interim analyses, the follow-up rules, how do we make sure that as we're progressing with data collection and the data analysis, that it's actually meeting our collective disciplinary needs as researchers? We have to think about integration, how the framework supports mixed methods. The synthesis explores our unique findings, our common findings and explanations. So we'll have things that overlap, and we'll be able to address those as interdisciplinary approach. Then we'll have things that are unique to one of the disciplines. How in our write-up, making sure that we are in our write-up actually saying, you know what, there's a finding that was unique to the economist. This was the finding. The geographer and the sociologist did not see correlation with that. But we have to be able to explain that there's both common and independent or unique findings. And finally, the thing that we have to consider in our framework for designing interdisciplinarity is ethical considerations. So it's both the individual scale and the collective. What might be considered ethical in, say, a geography approach may borderline as unethical from sociology. Now, the problem with ethics is it is not black and white. It is a continuum, and it's a different continuum for each of our disciplines. So when we're bringing 2 or more disciplines together, we've got to find out what are the ethical boundaries, and the creative methods we use will help solve that, okay? But we have to be able to identify what are the ethical boundaries, the ethical concerns from each discipline, and then how does that come together as a collective?